From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
As the left becomes less religious, they become more statist. And as the right becomes more religious, they still become more statist.
Whenever you add government, you by default remove community.
But it actually starts with Bush, right? Like in 2006.
That'd be the most satisfying, like, chair shot, ka-chung.
And I have no intention of keeping any promise that I make.
The radical messaging is almost more pragmatic sometimes.
It's bad that the state is as big as it is.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to The Naturalist Capitalist. As always, I am your host, Reed Coverdale, and we've got my friend Dack Rouleau back on the show again. How are you doing tonight, Dack?
I'm as perky as a rat in liverwurst. How are you?
I'm pretty good. That's about how good I figured you were. That's typically the state of happiness you're in.
Always.
So your channel just broke 1,000 subscribers, and you did a little video about that, which I kind of, I don't know if you'd agree, but I kind of liken your channel subscriptions to my Twitter following because it fluctuates a lot and it's hard to get above certain numbers because I tell them things that they don't like to hear, which you are very good at. But just give us a little bit of the story about how your channel started, what you've done over the last few years and what it's been like trying to find people who actually want to hear from you, because a lot of people don't like to be told the truth. They like to be told what reconfirms their confirmation bias they already have.
Well, actually, my channel started with me trying to find out the name of a bossa nova song that I was recording on my phone. And no one helped me out with that. But then about 6 months or 9 months later, I uploaded a video of myself asking Andrew Yang if he supports Julian Assange. And that was a video where I didn't know what Andrew Yang was going to say to me when I asked him. But I was disappointed that he gave an unsatisfying answer where he said that he thought Julian Assange should stand trial, etc. For people who have seen that video, yes, I am the man in the fedora. And the thing is, it was interesting how in that case, his fans, a lot of them actually defected from him at that moment. They said, I'm done with Andrew Yang. If he supports the prosecution of Assange, this is what Jamal Thomas called a problem perspective. And so they abandoned his campaign. And then I proceeded to do it with some other Democratic Party presidential candidates. And for the most part, the reaction was positive until I asked Bernie Sanders to declare his stance. And then that ruffled some feathers because, you see, I didn't understand the grand vision that Bernie Sanders had to conquer the presidential race and free the prisoner and God bless us all. I just wasn't smart enough to appreciate his grand design.
5D chess.
Yeah, that's the thing. And, I just want to say this. I just finished reading this great book called The Myth of the State by the late Ernst Cassirer. You almost certainly cannot find this book anywhere. I just found this beat up copy at a bookstore several months ago. But in that book, the author talks about how irrational thinking has taken over in politics. And this was a guy writing in 1945. So I can only imagine what he would say now. But the point is, the dark vision of the political culture that I was presenting in those videos with Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders and all of the rest, eventually the dark vision was affirmed by everything that has happened since. It's just that when I put the videos out initially, people for some reason are fickle and they don't want to admit that the situation is as bleak as it is. But ultimately it's proven right within about a year or so after I released the video. So haha for them. Yeah, that's pretty much how Overwritten came to be. And it's what it is now. And so I just crossed the threshold of 1,000 subscribers. And so I guess I'm feeling good about the channel.
Yeah. So have you noticed that people are fickle to their principles and loyal to their icons, and that's obviously problematic because you will see a complete transformation of ideology amongst a certain support base of some candidates. So, for example, I saw some people saying that Tulsi Gabbard should run for president with what's his name? Dan Crenshaw for one, and then the other one was
Ahmad?
no, I'm blanking on his name now. The Ron DeSantis.
Oh,
So the fact that you have come so far that you want someone that you supported to run with Ron DeSantis when the person that you were supporting was all about ending occupation in the Middle East and not going to war with Iran. That's just an interesting that's an interesting change in position suddenly, where you are someone who's maintained loyalty to your principles, and that has burned a lot of bridges for you. That's caused a lot of people to stop following you. What has that been like? Like, I mean, you must feel good about yourself that you've actually stayed the course and said what you believe is true.
I feel good that I'm not on Twitter anymore, because what happened was we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of when this person who pretends to be the victim of assassination attempts put out an article slandering me. And I saw in the reaction to that article, her audience proceeded to unfollow me. And so I had this moment of awakening where I realized that for the most part, the audience is really not as intelligent as we would like to think they are. We like to think that the people we talk to on Twitter are actually informed about the political issues that they presume to speak about. But in reality, we can see that they're just a bunch of reactionaries, which is they're reacting to the political trend of the moment, which is why they can simultaneously support Tulsi Gabbard and Ron DeSantis. It makes no sense at all, but they're just making this up as they go along. And so with the work that I've done, I'm not saying I haven't made any mistakes, because I was definitely caught up in that reactionaryism for a while, where I thought that there was no chance on earth that Joe Biden could possibly win the election. But now that I've stepped outside of that Twitter echo chamber, we do have an overwritten Twitter account, but I have no involvement. Now that I've stepped out of that and I'm no longer part of that cyclical, maladaptive, pseudo-progressive echo chamber, I find that I'm able to think much more clearly. And that's why I'm able to put out videos like the one where I said, I don't watch Jimmy Dore and I don't care who knows it. I'm glad Nina Turner lost because it's going to discourage people from believing in this political pyramid scheme that we run. I enjoy having the ability to speak freely about these things, as long as YouTube doesn't come after my channel.
Yeah, they haven't come after me yet. I'm not sure why, but I feel like it's just because I'm not big enough yet. I feel like once I reach a certain threshold, that
probably
things I've already said on this channel, guests I've already had, are probably going to be problematic in the future. But yeah, the name of this episode is kind of indicative of what we're going to be talking about. And you did a whole video about this. I think it was titled "Stop Pretending You Care About Afghanistan."
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it was very good. I recommend everyone go watch it. But it mirrors a lot of the things that I've been saying too. As you remember in 2019, when Trump hinted at removing troops from Syria, and he did keep troops there to protect the oil, but he was removing a lot of the occupation force, and then he just sent them to Iraq. He didn't bring them home. But that aside, he was talking about withdrawing from Syria, and the bawling of the corporate media over the Kurds ensued for several days. And I swear half of them didn't know who the Kurds were the day before Trump decided to start withdrawing troops from Syria. None of the fan base of, The View or some CNN anchor or whatever, none of them knew who the Kurds were a day earlier. But suddenly everyone was all up in arms about how we had betrayed our allies. They were going to be slaughtered by the Turkish army. And, this was the most disgraceful thing any president has ever done.
Yeah.
I think the exact same thing happened with Joe Biden right now over the Afghans that we're leaving behind, that are going to be subject to the Taliban's horrible abuse of women. And it's like, I don't know. There's not been any outcry over horrible crimes committed by the United States over the last 2 decades that we've been in Afghanistan or any of these countries. The very little outcry from the media or from regular everyday people. But now that we have people clinging onto airplanes, and we have dogs being left in, cages, and we have women who are going to be subject to the Taliban's rule, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. Joe Biden is a disgrace to America. I just I've already seen your video, but I was wondering if you have any more thoughts you'd like to express, and what do you think about this reaction that we're seeing from people as soon as we finally find time to end America's longest war?
Well, it's interesting to see how the progressives are being roped into acting as useful idiots for the Republican Party. You've seen a lot of these progressives on social media who are jumping on the anti-Biden bandwagon. And obviously, I don't have a single complimentary word to say about Joe Biden.
Sure.
But the problem is that you can see how dishonest and how underhanded a lot of the criticism that Biden is getting on Fox News is. Fox News is a warmongering propaganda network, and just because a couple of their commentators make funny jokes at Biden's expense, that doesn't undo that channel's really ignominious history. And so Fox News, in the way it's piling on Joe Biden, this is not a pacifistic network. This is a network that loves war, that advocates for war. And so Joe Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, this gives Fox and the neoconservatives an opportunity to insist that the whole world would fall apart if America's international police force was not constantly omnipresent in every nation on earth at the same time. This is basically the same ridiculous message that Bill Maher sent to his audience last week. And we can see that a lot of the progressives are buying into it because they have this personal hatred of Joe Biden. And so the withdrawal from Afghanistan, what it illustrates is the imbecility of the idea that the American military should actually be involved in these countries in the first place. I would challenge anybody to actually try to define what Afghanistan is. What is Afghanistan? It's impossible to actually create a concrete conception of that country because the country as it exists today has been irreparably mauled by various military interventions, the United States, Russia, etc., over a period of several decades. So the country as it exists today is ravaged and unnatural. And so it's not Afghanistan in any kind of logical sense. It's a byproduct of relentless military intervention and destruction. And so the chaos that we see as America leaves, this is part of the necessary process. These same progressives who are piling on Joe Biden for his clumsy withdrawal, they don't seem to realize that if they got their way and if they actually had good politicians in power, we would see some chaos in the American establishment. We would see the corporate state react and convulse and go into all kinds of frenzies. This idea that you're somehow going to have a peaceful revolution, it doesn't make any sense. And so all of the commentary that's been critical of America, of the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan, is really just fueling the jingoistic mentality that led to us going into that country in the first place.
Yeah, so obviously you've been following Julian Assange very closely. Do you know much detail about the Afghan war documents that came out in 2010? Hundreds of civilians murdered, buses shot up, airstrikes that were supposed to take out Taliban targets, but they ended up killing lots of civilians. Can you give us any more extensive details on what the Afghan war documents released about what was going on in Afghanistan?
Well, generally, what it is just a bunch of confirmation of American war crimes. As far as the particulars, I'm not as well versed in those leaks as I am with the 2016 DNC leaks. Those are the ones I studied more extensively. But with the Afghan war logs, what you're basically dealing with is proof of American war crimes. And that isn't something that anybody in the political underground has a hard time accepting. But for some reason, the bourgeoisie and the masses in this country, it is just unfathomable to them, the idea that the American military could possibly commit crimes against humanity. It's just anathema to them. They're like, that's not something we are capable of doing. And so those Afghan war logs, those releases sent a shockwave to the collective psyche. And so rather than accept the evidence that the American military had been committing war crimes, people tried to rationalize it and shift the attention onto Assange, saying that he needs to be punished for providing proof of this. It's an example of don't shoot the messenger. But I think that's ultimately the reason why, is because people are too infantile to accept this evidence. Like we were talking about earlier, it takes time for people to accept something bleak. That's why they choose to demonize Assange instead of accepting the sobering, rather humbling reality of these releases.
Yeah, it's weird to me that all these, all these objections to violation of human rights that are going to happen under the Taliban, which they are going to happen, don't get me wrong, like the Taliban is not good, but complete ignorance or intentional ignorance of what happened in Afghanistan under the U.S. occupation at the same time. Because, I don't know how much of it is stupidity and how much of it is intentional blindness that the American public has. I tend to err more on the side of stupidity, because when you talk to your average American, they have no idea what the culture is like in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or any of these countries that, we're not constantly trying to subvert to our will. And I don't know, like it's just an amazing phenomenon that as soon as we try to end a conflict somewhere, suddenly any consequences of human suffering that are a byproduct of our leaving are our responsibility. When a lot of the things that are going to happen under the Taliban were already that way before the United States came in. So there's this argument that we destroyed that country, we need to stay there long enough to rebuild it, where we've seen the Taliban retake the entire country in a couple weeks, the Afghan army fold in like 72 hours. I'm wondering, like, what is there to fix at this point? I mean, the only thing that we should be upset about is all the people that we murdered, leaving them behind. But Afghanistan is basically going back to its old form of government before we came there in the first place. So all this outrage about, the women who are going to be persecuted and the people who are going to be shot, it's just so out of place and so, it's so cherry picked, I guess. I just want your reaction to that.
Well, you go back to what you said earlier about how the people who are talking about Afghanistan don't know anything about that country's history or culture. These people who are pontificating about that, they don't even understand their own American culture. How can they possibly understand any other nations? The only thing that people in this independent media sphere actually understand is they understand reactionaryism. And so they're able to explain the history of America's most recent occupation of Afghanistan. They're able to complain about that, but they can't actually talk about Afghan history prior to the American occupation. They can't talk about how Afghan culture changed or responded to the American occupation. And so now that America is leaving, you talk about this chaos with all of these different tragic things happening. To me, I don't see it as a tragedy at all. I see it as an inevitability. If you are going to actually begin the process of removing the invading force, and by the way, we should not assume that that's actually what's happening here. It's entirely possible that the American military could return, because this could be intended to send a message to people that America's military presence is needed. If we actually are serious about withdrawing our military, then we're going to have to expect chaos. We're going to have to expect convulsions. It's not going to be a smooth recovery process. And this idea that the American military needs to stay, that's like saying that you need to stay in the same house that your rapist lives in. The idea that there's somehow going to be some kind of healthy reconciliation between the two sides is just ridiculous. The only place for America in Afghanistan is as far away from that country as possible. And so these things are happening right now. I just see them as inevitabilities. I don't think they're things to mourn. I don't think they're things to lament. I don't think they're things to bash the Biden administration for. If the country is going to recover, it has to go through a period of deep internal chaos while it sorts out its own What kind of government do the people of Afghanistan want? What kind of culture do the people of Afghanistan want? If they don't want the Taliban, then it is now incumbent upon them to overcome the Taliban by overthrowing them. And that's not anything we can have any role in. Why should we have any role in that in the first place? So the people who are lamenting this stuff, I don't join them in their mourning, even at an abstract level. Honestly, I just see it as an inevitability and a necessity.
Yeah, I want to talk about the dogs, because that has become a highly emotional string for a lot of Americans. So I remember growing up watching cowboy and Indian movies, or the Lone Ranger or whatever. My little sister would always burst into tears when a horse died.
Yeah.
You know, there's men falling left and right, but then a horse gets shot and that's the end of the world. You know, they killed the poor horsey. And I realized what that is that's an emotional connection to something that you know you love, and you see it die. And so that, you know, that plays at your heartstrings or whatever. And that's what's going on with the dogs here. You know, hundreds of thousands of civilians all over the Middle East getting murdered all the time doesn't really resonate with anyone, because that's not something that they see happening here.
Yeah.
But when you see dogs that you can relate to because you have a dog, or you know someone who has a dog, and you see them left in their cages to starve, or for the Taliban to come kill them or whatever, that enrages you because it makes you feel bad. And it's not even necessarily that it makes you feel bad about the situation, but you can imagine that happening to your dog. And so that makes you sad. So really what this is all internalized. It's almost self-pity, because the emotions that you're experiencing from having to see what's going on over there enrage you more than the fact that it's actually happening, because you haven't given a shit for 2 decades. But as soon as something that you can relate to is put in front of your face, you're so mad that you had to see it. So you're virtue signaling to everyone else about how mad you are that this is happening, when you never have given a shit and you don't give a shit. It's just to make yourself feel better. That's what came out to me when everyone was freaking out about the dogs yesterday. But I wanted to hear what you think.
Well, there is a historical precedent for leaving the animals out of these kinds of conflicts. The idea of don't shoot the messenger. There's also the idea that you don't shoot the messenger's horse, because the horse is not part of the military conflict. It doesn't understand anything. And so that's why people tend to be sympathetic to, or historically, they've been sympathetic to animals in these military conflicts. But as for this particular issue of the dogs in the kennels, first of all, there's obviously the potential for a propagandistic element here. How do we know that imperialist warmongering media isn't seizing on this story in order to pull at the masses' rather feeble heartstrings? I'm very skeptical of that. I'm really skeptical of all of this major news coverage of this withdrawal from Afghanistan, just because if the mainstream media is so embedded within the military industrial complex that if they didn't want to broadcast this evidence of America's military failures, they obviously just wouldn't broadcast it. So we're receiving this information for a reason. But the problem of the animals is interesting because it is a very Americanized problem. It's very much a Western idea, this idea of the dog as your beloved family pet. And it's a bit of a first world problem, this idea that we go invade a foreign country and then we take it over and we make it so amenable to our culture that we're able to bring on service workers who require the use of a service dog. There's something so culturally imperialist about that, more so than militaristically imperialist. But with the dogs specifically, this is showing I would say the immaturity of the American people. I don't know if it's stupidity so much as it's immaturity. It's this infantile attachment to the cute, fuzzy animal. And this image is broadcast on the television screens to make us upset, to make us sad, to make us enraged. And I'll admit that when I saw it, I did feel bad for the dogs. I thought, I wish there was some way that because dogs are more pleasant to be around than people. But yeah, it's the way that people are falling for this, that they can't see that these images are being broadcast in order to manipulate them, in order to provoke the kind of intense emotional reaction that you're describing. People can't see that this is the oldest propagandistic trick in the book. I mean, just the idea that the bad guy in the movie is so evil that he hates puppies. It's very Cruella de Vil. But then again, that speaks to the infantile mentality of the American people. We compare political situations to the Avengers franchise because we are still stuck in this adolescent mindset.
So are you surprised to see this withdrawal? Because I am. I did not expect Donald Trump to actually pull the troops out of Afghanistan. What I thought when I first heard about this was, okay, you promised the American people that you were going to end these wars, and you haven't ended a single one. And this election is coming up, and you're not looking very good right now because of what a shambles the country is in. So you're going to virtue signal and say, okay, we're going to pull troops out of Afghanistan and we're going to end that occupation. And I was like, okay, sure. And then he actually started making moves toward doing it. And then Joe Biden wins the election and he becomes president. And I thought, well, that's the end of that. And then Joe Biden moves the withdrawal date from May 1st to September 11th. And I immediately thought, okay, that's it. This is just going to keep being kicked down the road. We're never going to leave. We have left. And I have to admit, I am surprised. I don't really understand what's going on. I am in a weird spot where I find myself agreeing more with Joe Biden's speech than what a lot of progressive leftists are saying right now, which is something you alluded to earlier in this conversation, because the anti-Biden leftist progressives hate him so much that it doesn't matter what he or his administration is doing. It's just that he's the one doing it. So whatever he does must be bad. I don't understand this timeline we're living in. It's very strange. And, you know, I do agree with you that this could be a false flag for something else. I don't know if we're going to get involved with Taiwan and China, or if we're going to start a war on terrorism back here at home. I don't really know what's coming next. But regardless of what is coming next, it is a good thing that we are out of Afghanistan. And I am shocked that it took Joe Biden's presidency to do it. What are your thoughts?
What did Joe Biden say in his speech? You mentioned that. I didn't catch that.
Have you seen either of his speeches on it?
I read a couple of fragments, but no, I didn't really care to listen to his voice. What did he say?
No, I mean, I can understand that, but he was saying that, you know, this war has gone on for 2 decades, and I don't want it to go on to yet another presidency. We could be there 5 more years, 10 more years, 20 more years. Nothing is going to change in Afghanistan. He actually kind of said what you just said, if the Afghan people want to fight the Taliban, that is on them. It's not on us. He did have some hawkish things to say about new threats that will be arising, you know, around the world. So who knows what that means. But in relation to leaving Afghanistan, it was very hard to disagree with anything he said in his speech. It could have been given by Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, the thing is, when Trump announced we were going to be leaving Afghanistan, I actually wrote an article about this at overwritten.org called Negotiating with Terrorists, the Art of the Deal. And the fatal flaw in his proposal was that it wasn't set to take effect until the summer of 2021. And as I wrote at the time, there's no guarantee that Donald Trump was still going to be president in the summer of 2021. Right. So yes, I was very surprised to see us leave. But the thing is, when the progressives direct their ire unto Biden, what they seem to forget is that Joe Biden has absolutely no control over anything that is actually going on in this government. I do not subscribe to the view that he has full-blown dementia. I used to be a case manager for a Medicaid program, and I had many clients who actually did have dementia, and I can say that Joe Biden does not have dementia. But it's obvious that he doesn't actually control anything in the government. He's just a spokesman for whatever agency he's speaking for. And so with the Pentagon, I very strongly doubt that the Pentagon if the Pentagon wanted to leave Afghanistan, I don't think they had to run that by Joe Biden at all. They probably just sent a memo to his desk explaining that we're going to be withdrawing on such and such a date. Be prepared to make a speech to that effect. And so that's what he did. He's just a spokesman. He's just a figurehead. And so when he is articulating this vision, I don't think it's his vision. I think it's just the message that the Pentagon wants him to broadcast. But you mentioned where we're going with this, where the new military focus is going to be, and you mentioned problems at home. Attorney General Merrick Garland has been talking at some length about his concern about domestic extremism under the guise of the Capitol riot, the so-called insurrection that almost tore this country apart. It was all a charade, of course, but it's given the government an opportunity to escalate its own internal surveillance, its crackdown on dissent and radicalism and extremism, channels like the one that we are broadcasting on right now. And so the focus is probably going to shift to domestic terrorism. The reason why I think they're making that shift is because they recognize that the empire is wobbling. They recognize that this empire is in decline, and perhaps in more rapid decline than anyone is comfortable admitting. And so for that reason, they are going to have to expect a lot of very intense convulsions on the part of the American people. Because as you lose your job, and as you lose your financial security, and as your entire life begins to unravel because of the state's disastrous policies, you're going to start reacting more and more violently. And so that's where they have to be prepared. They have to be prepared for legitimate civil unrest, not like that stupid Capitol riot, but people actually getting desperate and going berserk. That's what they're afraid of, and that's what they're preparing for. And so pulling the soldiers out of a country like Afghanistan and preparing them for the upcoming dissolution of the social fabric here, I think is just sound administrative strategy.
Yeah. So do you expect to see that in other areas of the world, start to see us toning our imperialism back, or at least in the sense of ground troop invasion forces or occupying forces? Do you think you'll see that in Iraq next, and maybe we'll stop supporting the blockade in Yemen? Because we are so thin spread, and the thing is, the people at the top, I don't buy so much that they're stupid. I had Peter Schiff on the other day. We were talking about the economy, and I think he believes they're stupid. I tend to believe that they're more malicious, that they do know what's going to happen. They do know that this is a house of cards that's going to come crashing down, and they want to come out on top. So maybe the best move is to consolidate forces that are all around the globe right now and bring them back home. So do you think that's something we could see continuing?
As for whether the people in charge are stupid, this is something I'm going to be writing about in my upcoming book about the election of 2020. The people who are actually making the decisions, the people behind the scenes that we don't see or talk about, those people are not stupid. The politicians like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are stupid. I don't consider them to be intelligent. I think that they are just very informed about the machinery of government. They understand the corrupt mechanisms whereby things get done. So they have that kind of knowledge or experience, but I don't think that they're intelligent beyond that. They're just sort of cynical or disillusioned. As for the withdrawal of soldiers, like foot soldiers on the ground, to use a sickening cliche, yes, I do think that's going to happen, not just in order to prepare for the war on domestic extremism, but also because I don't know that it's especially necessary in the modern day. We see what's happening in Venezuela, for example. The United States is slowly unraveling that country. The United States is slowly running Venezuela into the ground, and there are no American soldiers in Venezuela. There's just a very effective, for lack of a better word, a very effective system of sanctions and economic strangulation, and this doesn't involve guns at all. So the United States can exploit its relationship with other countries in order to accomplish its imperialist goals without firing any bullets. And you could, in theory, see that in other countries. Iraq, I think we have a puppet government established in Iraq at this point. So why American soldiers are even necessary there, I'm not sure, but that country is easy enough to control. Now, in a country like Syria, where the United States has already made such a significant militaristic investment, it may be that a bit more active imperialism is necessary to finish the job. A country like Iran, 50-50. And then there are countries like China and Russia that the United States obviously can't go to war with those countries because it would be the end of all organized life on the planet. And so this rhetoric, this anti-China, anti-Russia rhetoric we hear, that's just a lot of talk. That's just fodder for shows like this, for things for us to talk about, but it doesn't actually make any substantive difference. So yeah, I do think that the active military force is going to be reduced in time, just as a matter of adaptation, just because it's not necessary anymore. Kind of reminds me of when Obama was debating Romney, and Romney was complaining that the Navy is smaller than it used to be, and Obama said, well, we also have fewer horses and bayonets. That's what I see a lot of this being. So it's not that there's any kind of benevolence emerging on the part of the government. It's just that it's not tactically required anymore.
So do you think the war on domestic extremism is going to be less effective than the war on terrorism was? I mean, not that the war on terrorism was effective at all. It increased terrorism, but do you think it's going to be harder to turn American soldiers on Americans than it was to create animosity against foreigners for them?
No, not at all, because you see such intense interpersonal, intra-national hatred in this country already. You can see that people in this country really do hate each other. Right. And I think a lot of that hatred is fostered by the dysfunctional policies of the government. But nevertheless, you see that we have these wars going on the street, where people who voted for Biden absolutely hate the people who voted for Trump, and vice versa. The people of this country are being told to go at each other's throats. So the people who go into the military, who, let's be honest, they're doing it because they wanted a job. Nobody drafted them. They can be told that the people they're fighting on the streets are their enemies. And so that's why they'll go after them. They're not going to feel any kind of allegiance to the American people, especially if they're told that the people that they're rounding up are the malcontents that are causing these problems in the country to begin with. That's the whole thing with our modern political ideologies, is both sides say that the country would be so perfect with the system that we have right now if only we could get rid of these bad people on this side or that side. If only we could get rid of those atavistic, retrograde racists on the right, this country would be a prosperous, multiracial paradise. And then the right says that if only we could get rid of those nihilists advocating their critical race theory and all this other nonsense, we could go back to the glorious days of yesteryear. We just got to get rid of those bad apples. And so the military can be given a similar message, that this country is going to be great again just as soon as we get rid of those terroriorists, I suppose, among the general population. And so, no, they're not going to feel any loyalty to their country folk. I mean, this isn't that. I think that's a pastoral myth that will be discredited very quickly.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that was exemplified with the police over the last year and a half. Yeah. I mean, if people, the police have a much more homegrown attachment to their citizenry than the military does, because the military, you could, even if your National Guard is brought out against you, you could be from southern Alabama and you're deployed somewhere up in northern Alabama where you don't know anyone, where the police force is much more localized, much more familiar with the people that they're dealing with. But they turned on them like dogs, pretty much no issue. There was lots of brutal, and I realized there were a lot of riots going on, but if you watched closely, there were very few police showing up to riots to protect private property and protect people from thugs. Most of the police were beating on people with no weapons who were peacefully protesting, and that took no encouragement. So the idea that the military would remain loyal to the citizenry over what the government asked them to do, I do think is a myth at this point. I would agree.
Well, the state also sets people up and exploits them and cannibalizes them. This is a subject that I'm going to be examining in a future video on my channel in more detail. But we have right now, you see these people who are being brought to trial. It's not really being reported in the mainstream media, but I'm aware of it, is these people are being brought to trial because of the things they did during the BLM protests last summer. You might have some random guy who like threw a brick at a storefront window or something like that. The Democratic Party encouraged this sort of thing in order to show how Donald Trump was tearing the country apart.
Sure.
And so the Democrats exploited that and got into power because of it. But now that that guy who threw the brick at the window is facing terrorism charges, really, he's facing several years in prison because he participated in a riot, which is a felony, by the way. Where are the Democrats coming to his defense? They're nowhere to be found, allowing him to go to prison. And you could argument about what happened to the people broke into the Capitol. You could argue that Donald Trump let them up, and now that they are facing a few years in federal prison, where's Donald Trump advocating on their behalf? He left them high and dry. And so this deliberate cannibalization of the general population, I see no reason why that wouldn't extend to a fictitious war on domestic extremism.
Yeah, my friend Drew Hancock did a great video about ending all wars, and he made the point that wars have become wars on ideas instead of wars with, distinct goals of conquering some country or defeating some enemy. Even World War II wasn't so much a war on fascism; it was a war against Germany and Japan. There were very clear enemies that we had. It was obvious what the goal was. The war on terrorism is very vague. It stretches many different countries, different continents. It's something that can pop up anywhere. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on climate change that's starting now. All of these things are so vague that the enemy can always exist if the elite want it to, and it can take any form that they want it to as well. So we're really talking about an age of literally endless wars that they can just keep going as long as they want, because when throwing a brick at a window is terrorism, I mean, if we're getting into a battle where definitions are that vague, then we're really in trouble. I mean, we're talking about things that can just never be defeated if the elite don't want them to be.
Well, let me go back to the book I mentioned at the beginning of this. The Myth of the State was written by a man named Ernst Cassirer, who was a German Jew who had to flee his country in 1933. And in this book, he writes about how myth and irrational thinking led to the rise of modern totalitarianism. And when he says modern totalitarianism, he's referring to Hitler. Cassirer died in 1945, I believe. But in his book, it is really disturbing how closely what he's describing parallels what we're dealing with in America today. And I actually just have a quick quote here of his description of totalitarianism that I want to read. A quote: "No one could walk in the street. Nobody could greet his neighbor without performing a political ritual. And just as in primitive societies, the neglect of one of the prescribed rites has meant misery and death. Even in young children, this is not regarded as a mere sin of omission. It becomes a crime against the majesty of the leader and the totalitarian state." And this is what we're seeing right now with this relentless political proselytization, where everyone is sucked into the war by being forced to choose a side. You can't remain on the sidelines and say, I don't believe in these politicians, because then someone on the left is going to say, well, then I suppose you don't care about black people and you don't care about women. And someone on the right is going to say, you don't care about freedom and you don't care about American history and values and all of this other stuff. You are compelled into choosing a side in this militaristic or quasi-militaristic conflict. And so this is why I struggle to find the psychological strength to continue analyzing the news, just because I wonder if it's making me an unwitting soldier on one of these sides. I really don't know, but I'm suspicious of it. And I wonder if it's time to just cut myself off from that maladaptive culture completely.
Yeah, that was what I wanted to ask you is why do you do what you do? Like what's the point on this point in the timeline? Is it just so that you feel that you did everything you could, or is it to actually try to affect change, or is it so that people will remember your name in the future when things get worse and you can say, I told you so? What is the impetus that keeps you going and keeps you involved with trying to tell people what's going on?
Well, I can't deny that my own narcissistic tendencies have no role in it at all. I mean, we all must be to some extent narcissistic if we're doing these shows. Anybody who tries to tell you they're just doing this from the kindness of their heart and they feel this moralistic compulsion to do it, unsubscribe from that channel immediately. And if I ever say that, please unsubscribe from me immediately. What's happening with my show is I felt compelled just to share my thoughts in order to get them out there, because when I read these things, I find them interesting. Like that quote I just read to you from that book, that's going to be the subject of a video that comes out in a few days on my channel, because I feel that if I don't talk about these things, I'm going to forget about them in some way. And so, because there's just so much information bombarding us, or at least I feel like there's so much information constantly bombarding me, that I feel it's necessary to take some time out of my day in order to put it into some kind of structure, I guess. I'm trying to make the thoughts apprehended in a sense. And so the best way I know how to do that is just to do short videos. Moving forward, I'm hoping to do more videos just focused on the books that I'm reading, going back to reading books like The Myth of the State. I regret, that it's a book that's so loaded with so much knowledge, so much historical and philosophical understanding. And I regret failing to do 100 videos as I was reading the book saying, hey, I read this part of the book today and it was really interesting. I just feel that it's important to do videos not about what's going on or what's of interest to the masses, but to do videos about what is making you think. Like, it's just what is actually making me think. And it's the books that I'm reading. And so I feel it's necessary to share them with people. Because, like, if one person who watches this video says, I'm going to check that book out, and then reads it and says, wow, interesting, I want to learn more about philosophy, I consider that a success. Honestly, not to sound cheesy or anything, but I do. I consider that a success.
Yeah. I remember you saying on an earlier show, I don't remember how long ago, I think about a year ago, though, that people should read books that were written in a different time. And the reasoning that we arrived at was because nowadays there are so many labels that people identify with that will remove their critical thinking from what's actually happening. So if you take out the word Democrat, Republican, Trump, Biden, America, whatever, and you can tell a story that is compelling and shows an obvious plot and shows an obvious agenda without any of these labels that you're clinging on to, the message will resonate. It'll get through. I think that's very true. It's been a year. It's been around a year since you said that. And I've just noticed how true that is, because these labels are what keep us from moving forward, because people have stupid allegiances, stupid biases, toward things that they really shouldn't, but they're just so used to them that it makes them comfortable to be on that side. So if you're on the side of America, you are on the right side because America has always been right. If you're on the side of progressivism, you're always right because progress has always been good. And it completely blinds them to what's actually happening, because whatever this adjective or description or label or word is trumps the entirety of the situation in their minds. But anyway, you said that a year ago. You obviously still believe that, right?
Yeah, I want to say what exactly I said at the time was that I would not read any books, or I would stay away from anything that was produced within the last 5 years. Basically,
Right.
from the moment Trump was elected until I don't know exactly when, but what I think is that when Trump was elected, we entered in a kind of cultural and intellectual dark age. And that wasn't Trump's fault per se, but what happened was the media became so partisan and so hyperactive in its emotional energy, specifically its negative emotional energy, that I think it had a very damaging and deleterious effect on our collective consciousness. And so, because of that, I was really distrustful of books that were written while Trump was in office, movies that were produced while Trump was in office. I was just, there was only one film that was produced during the Trump era that I thought was actually worth anything, and that was the film Midsummer. There were probably other good movies that were produced during that time, but I think that for the most part, the writers and the directors were being subconsciously influenced by this chaotic political and media culture that they found themselves in. And there were probably good books written during that time too, but I thought just it would be better to read books and watch movies that were made during a time when people were able to think a bit more calmly and a bit more clearly. And so now that Biden has been elected, I think that maybe people are beginning to recover mentally a little bit. Again, not because of any benevolence on Biden's part, but just because that's the shift that we're living in. And so that is why I say people should not read any political literature that was written between the years 2016 and 2021, at the very least. The older, the better. And one of the benefits of reading older political literature or philosophy or whatever is that it helps you to overcome your own narcissism, because you begin to realize, hey, these problems we're dealing with, these aren't new problems. These aren't the most important problems in human history, because Ernst Cassirer was dealing with very similar things 75 years ago. Plato was dealing with very similar things 2,500 years ago. We're not, so it helps to pull us out of our own narcissistic funk.
Yeah, totally agreed. Well, thank you for coming on again, Dack. For those of you in the audience who don't know, I'm going on his channel once a month, and he's coming on here once a month.
Yeah.
And I enjoy our discussions. I like the way you think. So I have your YouTube channel and Overwritten linked in the description. Is there anywhere else you want people to follow you, or anything interesting you have coming up that you want to talk about?
Well, they can follow the Twitter account if they'd like. It's mostly just announcing the videos that I've posted on the channel. I don't write articles as much as I used to, because I've been so busy working on my book about the 2020 election. But I'm going to be doing a video soon talking about the totalitarian element of our political culture. And I'm also going to be doing a status report soon talking about the part of the book that I've written so far and how it's made me think about that presidential election, having removed myself from it for a little while. So those are just some things people can look forward to if they're interested, if it's going to make them think.
All right, guys, go follow Dack Rouleau on Overwritten and subscribe to his YouTube channel. Get him up to the 2,000 mark next. So keep producing content that people hate and want to unfollow him for.
Yes.
I will be on with Justin O'Donnell and Joe Evans on Saturday. They're both Afghanistan war veterans, and we'll be talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then the following week, we got some interesting guests coming up, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching. Dack, thanks for coming back on.
Thank you, Reed. I'll see you.